She ran into the desert to die, as the monster her scars made her believe she was. But she encountered an enemy warrior who kissed each of those marks and crowned her as his queen. If stories about the power of resilience resonate with you, subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. The smell of gunpowder and dust filled her lungs, acrid smoke mingling with the metallic odor of blood. Crouched behind a rocky outcrop, Liana couldn't feel the rough fabric of a shawl hiding her face, only the cold weight of the rifle in her hands. The flames of a nearby campfire danced, casting monstrous shadows that no longer frightened her. On the contrary, she felt part of them. The screams in Spanish, her native tongue, were now the sound of danger, cruel voices echoing the humiliation that had driven her to her death. But she wasn't dying. Her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear but from icy fury, she watched Gokliya's figure fall to his knees. The world seemed to fall silent, and the monster they had created finally found its purpose, to protect the only man who didn't see her as a freak. Her face, the left side scarred by ancient fire, was fully exposed to the flickering light. The scars, which had once burned with shame, now seemed to map her pain and her strength. She was no longer the village's La Quemada, a creature to be pointed at and despised. Here, in the heart of Apache territory, under the starry desert sky, she was a defender. Her breath came in visible puffs in the cold night air, her eyes fixed on the militia leader, the same man whose mockery had been the final straw. He didn't recognize her immediately, seeing only a defiant figure who refused to back down. And in that brief moment of hesitation, Liana raised her rifle, the sights finding their target. The hand that had once trembled to hide her marks was now steady, ready to rewrite her history with a single shot. But to understand how we got to this point, we need to go back in time. The village was a cluster of adobe houses under a relentless sun, where the fine dust of the Sonoran Desert covered everything with a layer of resignation. For Liana Vasquez, this dust was a cloak. She moved through the narrow streets, always in the early morning or late afternoon, when the long shadows could swallow her. A thick shawl, inherited from her mother, was her shield, covering not only her hair but the left side of her face and neck, the land ravaged by the fire that had stolen her family and her identity. She was a ghost in her own life, a presence people sensed but refused to see. Her days were a silent routine, fetching water, tending the small garden in the back of her modest home, and trading a few vegetables for essentials, always with her eyes downcast, her voice a whisper that barely dared to exist. The memory of the fire was a living ember in her mind. She was only 6 years old when the bandits attacked the farm, and the flames consumed her world. The smell of burning wood and the searing pain were ghosts that visited her on sleepless nights. But the physical pain had become insignificant compared to the daily agony of contempt. The nickname La Quemada was whispered on street corners and sometimes spat in her direction by cruel children who mirrored their parents' intolerance. She remembered her mother's gentle touch, a painful contrast to the instinctive recoil of people in the market if her hand accidentally brushed against theirs. This fear of human touch became a second skin, an invisible barrier that isolated her even more than the shawl itself, reinforcing the poisonous belief that blossomed in her heart. She was a monster. The night of the village's annual festival arrived with the promise of music and joy, an oasis of celebration in the desert monotony. Liana watched the preparations from her window, the glow of colorful lanterns and the distant sound of a guitar awakening an aching longing in her chest. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream. She imagined herself blending into the crowd, perhaps even smiling, an ordinary person among so many. Moved by this impulse of fragile and dangerous hope, she did something she hadn't done in years. She chose a dress that was neither grey nor brown, but a faded blue reminiscent of the sky at dawn. With her shawl firmly in place, She stepped out into the night, not to participate, but to watch from the shadows, to steal a fragment of happiness that wasn't hers, foolishly, believing she could go unnoticed. Her presence, however, was noticed. Ricardo, a man whose arrogance was as great as his lands, spotted her huddled near an old well. With a cruel smile, he approached, his loud, drunken voice cutting through the music. "Look, La Quemada has come to haunt our party," he bellowed, and a circle of onlookers formed. With a quick, violent gesture, he pulled Liana's shawl away, exposing her face to the merciless light of the lanterns. The silence that followed was broken by gasps of shock and nervous giggles. "What a freak!" he spat, and the crowd, once festive, now regarded her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Every glance was a dagger, every stifled laugh a hammer blow to her already fragile spirit. That small fragment of hope shattered into a million pieces. With the words "freak" echoing in her ears like a final verdict, Liana didn't run home. She ran into the darkness, beyond the village limits, toward the vast, indifferent silence of the Sonoran Desert. Each step was driven by a crushing certainty. There was no place for her among men. If she was a monster, then she should live where monsters belonged, in the wild desolation, far from judging eyes and condemning voices. The shawl, symbol of her shame, was left behind, lying in the dust of the square. For the first time, she didn't try to hide. She let the cold night wind whip at her scarred face, feeling a strange, bitter freedom in complete surrender. The pain in her chest was as vast as the dark horizon before her, and she embraced it, determined to let nature finish what the fire had started. She walked for hours, aimlessly, guided only by the pale moon that illuminated a world of skeletal cacti and endless sand. Thirst began to tear at her throat, and her feet, protected only by thin sandals, bled from the thorns and stones. The desert, with its austere and brutal beauty, offered no solace, only the promise of an end. And that was what Liana sought. When the first light of dawn painted the sky pink and orange, her strength finally ebbed. She stumbled and fell onto the cold sand, her body trembling with exhaustion and dehydration. Looking at the immensity surrounding her, she felt a somber peace. There, at least, she would die as Liana, and not as La Quemada. Her eyes closed, the rising sun on her scarred face, her final goodbye, surrendering herself to oblivion. Liana's courage at this moment is what inspires us. If you feel this strength too, show your support by leaving a comment. And to not miss a step of this and other incredible journeys of overcoming, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Consciousness returned to Liana not in a wave, but in a slow trickle. The first sensation was the absence of pain. The blazing sun didn't burn her skin. Instead, a providential shade covered it. A damp, earthy taste in her mouth replaced the dryness of dehydration. Her eyes opened slowly, her blurred vision focusing on a crouching figure a few feet away. It was a man, an Apache warrior, unmistakable by his long dark braids and the knife sheathed at his hip. Panic should have been her first reaction. Years of horror stories about the savages had prepared her for this, but panic didn't come. What paralyzed her was his gaze. There was no hatred, no contempt, not even pity. There was a stillness, an intense, deep curiosity, as if he were reading the stories her scars told, not with revulsion, but with indecipherable respect. Instinct, honed by years of humiliation, made her raise her hand to cover her face, a gesture as automatic as breathing. She flinched, waiting for the blow or the cruel word that would surely come. But the warrior remained motionless. He merely inclined his head slightly, his dark eyes never straying from hers. Then slowly, so as not to startle her, he held out a water skin. It wasn't an order, but a silent invitation. Liana hesitated, fear warring with her body's desperate need. Kindness in such an unlikely place was more disorienting than any threat. Her hand trembled as she accepted the water skin, and as she drank the life-saving water, The complete absence of disgust in the stranger's gaze began to open the first microscopic crack in the wall of self-loathing she had built around her heart. Gokliya guided her through canyons and trails known only to him, a winding path that took her deep into the heart of the Chihuahua Mountains. Arriving at the Apache camp, nestled in a sheltered valley, was an assault on Liana's senses. The scent of juniper smoke and roasting meat hung in the air, mingling with the scent of leather and dried herbs. Curious-eyed children stopped their games to stare at her, while the women, busy with their chores, gave her hard, suspicious looks. Every face she met was a mirror of her own condition as an outsider, a Mexican woman in enemy territory. The fear, which had subsided under Gokliya's calm gaze, returned with a vengeance. She instinctively cringed, feeling the weight of hundreds of years of conflict and hatred between her peoples fall squarely on her shoulders. She had fled one hell only to be thrown into another. The most imposing figure to confront them was not a warrior, but an elderly woman with a face as wrinkled as the bark of an ancient tree and dark eyes that held the wisdom and pain of generations. It was Tazana, the tribe's healer, and Gokliya's mother. She approached, ignoring Liana completely, and speaking to her son in a harsh, guttural language. Her words were sharp, and her gaze swept Liana from head to toe, lingering on her scars with an expression not of pity, but of cold assessment. Tazana saw there not a wounded woman, but another mouth to feed, a potential weakness, and worse, a Nakaye, a Mexican. She represented the wall of tradition and distrust, the guardian of her people's safety, and in her eyes, Liana was nothing more than an omen, a problem her foolish son had brought from the desert. The days that followed were a lesson in invisibility. Liana was given a place to sleep and a ration of food, but in return, she was expected to work inconspicuously. Her tasks were the most unwelcome: cleaning hides, carrying water, and mending clothes, which Apache women did not wish to do. She performed her duties in silence, her head always bowed, recreating her old pattern of existence. Yet something was different. The indifference here was not tinged with contempt for her scars. It was a functional distrust of an outsider. For the first time, she was not La Quemada, but simply the Mexican. And in this anonymity, she observed the way children were taught to track, the reverence with which hunters treated their prey, and the complex web of relationships that united the tribe. The will to die had been replaced by a primal instinct for survival. One night, sitting away from the main fire, Liana was cleaning a cut on her own hand, a small wound from her daily work. She was so focused on her solitude that she didn't notice Gokliya's approach until his shadow fell over her. She flinched, her heart pounding. He crouched beside her, and for a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the crackling of the distant fire. Then he did the unthinkable. Slowly, he raised his hand, not to the wound, but to her face. Liana froze, her entire body tense, expecting revulsion. But his touch was like a feather. His warrior calloused fingers traced the edge of the largest scar on her cheek, not with pity or morbid curiosity, but with a reverence that took her breath away. That silent gesture demolished years of shame. For the first time, someone was touching her there, and it was not to hurt, but to honor. Gokliya's touch didn't erase the scars, but it lit a light in a room of her soul that Liana thought was permanently dark. She began to look up, to observe the world around her not just as a place of threats, but as a place of life. It was then that she noticed little. Nupeltsin, a boy of about 8, whose leg bore a nasty cut that refused to heal. The wound was inflamed, red and swollen, and a fever was beginning to take hold of the boy's body. Tazana had applied her pastes and prayers, but the infection seemed more stubborn than the old woman's wisdom. Liana saw the fear in the boy's mother's eyes, a fear she knew well. And in her mind, fragments of forgotten knowledge began to emerge. The lessons of her grandmother, a skilled healer on the power of agave leaves and the bark of certain desert trees. Hesitation paralyzed her. Interfering was a monumental risk. It would be seen as a direct affront to Tazana's authority, an act of unforgivable arrogance on the part of an outsider. The fear of being expelled, of returning to the solitude of the desert, screamed at her to remain invisible. But the boy's feverish moaning was louder. In an act of courage that surprised even herself, she walked away from the camp and into the arid vegetation. She knew what to look for. She returned with her hands full of leaves and roots, which she meticulously mashed with a stone until they formed a green, aromatic paste. Heart in her throat, she approached Nopaltzin's mother, offering the medicine with a pleading look. There were no words to explain, only the universal language of the intention to heal. To her surprise, the desperate woman nodded. Liana applied the paste with a delicacy reminiscent of her grandmother. She changed the dressing twice a day, under the watchful eye of nearly the entire tribe. The tension was palpable, but by the morning of the third day, Nopaltzin's fever had broken. The angry red of the wound gave way to a healing pink. The relief on the boy's mother's face was Liana's first reward. There was no applause or formal thanks, but the change was immediate and unmistakable. One of the women offered her a piece of still warm cornbread. An old warrior inclined his head in a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. And Tazana, the most skeptical of them all, approached and examined the remaining paste, smelling and touching it, her face a mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. Liana had not merely healed a child. She had proven that she carried within herself valuable knowledge, a strength that went beyond her appearance. Gokliya had observed everything from a distance, his pride a silent flame in his chest. From that day on, his guardianship over Liana deepened. He began taking her on his walks, no longer just to watch over her, but to teach her. The lessons came not in words, which were still few between them, but in gestures. He showed her how the direction a desert flower grew could indicate the presence of underground water, how a hawk's cry could announce the arrival of strangers, and how to read the stars as the map of Ndost's sun, the path of life. For Liana, who had always seen the desert as an enemy, a place of death, this new perspective was transformative. Through Gokliya's eyes, she began to see the stark beauty and profound wisdom of the land, understanding that every thorn, every rock had a purpose. But acceptance wasn't a blanket that covered the entire tribe. Liana's growing closeness to Gokliya, one of the most respected warriors, ignited resentment in some, especially Cato, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his knife. He saw Liana's influence as a stain on the tribe's honor. One afternoon, while she was grinding corn, Cato cornered her, his shadow looming over her like a vulture's. "Your witchcraft may have fooled others, Nakai." He spat the word venomously, "but I see what you are. A disease that weakens our blood, that bewitches our finest warrior with your deformed face." He expected her to shrink back, her shoulders to tremble with fear as before. The old Liana would have disappeared into herself, becoming small and invisible, but the woman he confronted now had felt the touch of reverence and the power of healing in her own hands. A silent, fierce battle raged within Liana in that instant. The urge to retreat, to hide, was a powerful current. But another force, new and tenacious, anchored her to the ground. Slowly she rose, setting the grinding stone aside. For the first time since arriving, she didn't hide her face. Instead, she met Cato's gaze, and the fire that had marked her forever seemed to glow behind her eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of her journey. "My name is Liana," he said, each syllable clear and firm. "The sorcery you see is my grandmother's lessons, which saved Nopaltzin, and the face you despise is testimony that I survived the fire. I survived your hatred. I survive you." The silence that followed was heavy, and Cato, without a response to her unexpected dignity, took a step back. Liana's courage reverberated throughout the camp. Those who had previously seen her only as a shadow now saw her as a woman of substance. The respect she had earned with her healing was now solidified by the strength of her spirit. That very night, a figure materialized beside her in the darkness. Tazana. The elder said nothing for a long time, simply sitting and watching the fire, her face a map of deep thoughts. Finally she turned to Liana, and her eyes, once cold and calculating, held a new glow. "The fire tested you," Tazana said, her voice as deep as the rolling of stones. "Hate tested you, and you did not break. A strong spirit is a powerful medicine, stronger than any herb." In that moment, Liana understood that the hardest-earned approval had finally been granted. Tazana's wall of distrust had become a door. The next day, Tazana led Liana away from camp to an ancient oak tree that had been struck by lightning decades ago. Half the tree was blackened and twisted, a massive scar against the sky. The other half, however, flourished with defiant vigor, its green branches and leaves full of life. "We Chiricahua believe in Ndostsan, the way of life," Tazana explained, touching the charred bark. "This path is not easy. It burns us, breaks us, and wounds us. Look at this tree. The lightning nearly killed it, leaving a mark of its pain for all to see. But the tree did not die. It used the wound to find a new way to grow, stronger than before. Your scars, child, are not your shame. They are proof that you faced the lightning and still stand. They are your armor." Tazana's lessons became the fertile soil where Liana's soul began to take root. Yet peace is a rare harvest in the desert. One afternoon, an Apache scout returned to camp, his body tense with urgency and his arm bleeding from a grazing gunshot. He brought grim news. A Mexican militia, larger and better equipped than the usual patrols, was advancing on their territory, moving with predatory determination. A wave of silent tension swept through the camp. The women began preparing emergency supplies, and the warriors gathered, their faces transformed into granite. Masks. For Liana, the news was a stab of ice. She knew who these men were. They were an extension of Ricardo, of the village, of the cruelty that had driven her away. That world of hatred had not been content to spit her out. Now it came to destroy her only refuge. The warriors gathered around a makeshift map drawn in the sand. The scout described the militia's route, and the Apache plan began to form. An ambush in a narrow canyon known as Serpent's Throat. As Liana listened, a chill ran down her spine. She knew this place, and she knew the arrogance of men like Ricardo. They wouldn't be so predictable. She remembered a barely discernible goat trail that branched off before the canyon's entrance, a treacherous route her father had shown her years before. An impatient and presumptuous leader could use it to outflank anyone waiting in the gorge. Her knowledge, once a source of painful memories of a lost life, now became a potential weapon. The lives of everyone there, Gokliya's life, could depend on what only she knew. The fear of speaking was a physical gag, but the fear of remaining silent was even greater. Liana took a step forward, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. "They won't just come for the throat," she said, her voice louder than she had ever used in that camp. All eyes turned to her. The contempt on Cato's face was evident, but Gokliya's gaze was an invitation for her to continue. Picking up a twig, she knelt and altered the map in the sand, drawing the winding line of the forgotten trail. "There is another way," she explained, urgency giving firmness to her voice. "A hunter's trail. It is dangerous, but a man who seeks the glory of surprise would use it to corner you. They will divide you, attacking from the front and rear." She spoke with the certainty of someone who knew not only the terrain, but the mindset of her enemies. Her intervention was met with hostile silence. Cato was the first to break the spell, his voice dripping with venom. "And how do we know this isn't a trap? that the Mexican isn't leading us to the slaughter to save her own skin. The accusation of treason hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Liana felt her blood run cold, but before she could defend herself, Gokliya intervened. "She speaks the truth," he said with imposing calm. "She knows the ways of the Nakaye better than we do. Her loyalty healed our children, and her courage faced scorn. I trust in her wisdom." Tazana, watching from afar, gave a barely perceptible nod of agreement. The tribal chief, an old and wise man, looked from Liana to the map, then to the horizon. "We've changed the plan," he finally declared. "We'll prepare a reception on the hunter's trail." Trust, a prize she never dreamed of receiving, was placed in her hands. The chief's decision transformed the camp into a hive of focused, lethal activity. The warriors readied their weapons not with the fury of rage, but with the cold precision of those defending their home. Liana, now a central cog in the tribe's survival mechanism, moved among them, her fear a ball of ice in her stomach. She was no longer a passive spectator of fate. She was an active participant, and the weight of this responsibility was crushing. Beside Tazana, she tore fabrics to make bandages and prepared infusions for the pain, each knot and leaf a silent prayer for the safety of the men who would fight. The scent of medicinal herbs mingled with the metallic tension in the air. She looked at the faces of the warriors, faces that had once regarded her with suspicion and now passed her by with a nod of respect, and felt a protective terror she had never imagined herself capable of. When the time came for departure, under the cover of a moonless night, Gokliya found her. He said nothing. Words were insufficient for the abyss they faced. Instead, he raised his hand and with his thumb traced a soft line over her scar, a gesture that had become their secret language. But this time, the meaning was different. It wasn't just acceptance, it was a promise, a bond. He then placed the same thumb against his own heart, a silent oath that she was with him, and he would return to her. Liana swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. Her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. Watching him dissolve into the darkness with the other warriors was the hardest thing she had ever done, a terrifying act of faith in her own newfound strength and in the man who had taught her to see it. The next few hours dragged by with tortured slowness. The camp, stripped of its warriors, became a place of tense silence. The women continued their tasks with forced normalcy, but their eyes betrayed anxiety, constantly straying toward the valley entrance. Liana felt each second slip by like a grain of sand in an open wound. Doubt, a poisonous serpent, began to coil in her heart. What if she was wrong? What if her memory had betrayed her, sending Gokliya and the others to their deaths? She tried to focus on the rhythm of her work, grinding herbs with Tazana, but the sound of the stone in the mortar seemed to echo the frantic beating of her own pulse. The fate of her new people, the only ones who had accepted her, rested on the shoulders of a childhood memory, and this certainty was an almost unbearable burden. The first sound to break the stillness was not the warrior's return, but the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle coming from the wrong direction, and close, too close. Panic blossomed instantly. Cries of alarm rang out as women clutched their children. Liana ran to the edge of the camp, her blood running cold. Emerging from the rocks not far away was a second contingent of militiamen, led by none other than Ricardo. His face was contorted in a triumphant, smug smile. His strategy had been more treacherous than she had imagined. He hadn't just divided his forces for the ambush on the trail. He'd sent a smaller group to what he believed would be an easy target, an undefended camp. The confrontation Liana had planned was taking place miles away, but the real war, her personal war, had just arrived at her doorstep. Chaos erupted like a sudden storm. Ricardo and his men advanced, firing at the huts, their cruel laughter echoing through the valley. The few elderly men and young boys who remained in the camp formed a desperate line of defense, but they were few and ill-armed against the militia's fury. Liana saw one of the elders who had taught her to identify constellations fall with a muffled scream. Terror paralyzed her for a second, the same overwhelming sensation from the night of the fire. Instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to bury herself in any hole to survive. But then she saw Ricardo's face, the same sneer that had broken her at the party, and the terror turned to embers. This man, the embodiment of her trauma, would not take this home from her too. The choice was made. She was no longer a victim to hide. As Tazana tried to drag a child to safety, a bullet struck her in the leg, causing her to fall. Seeing her mentor, her second mother, lying wounded on the ground was the spark that lit the powder keg inside Liana. She ran, grabbed the fallen elder's rifle, and positioned herself behind a rocky outcrop, the same place we saw her at the beginning of our story. Gokliya's observational training sharpened her senses. She waited for the right moment, when Ricardo, drunk with power, stopped to reload his weapon. It was then that he saw her. His eyes widened in shock and confusion, unable to process the image of the pathetic village freak now staring at him through the scope of a rifle, her face etched not with shame, but with incandescent fury. His hesitation was his fatal mistake. Liana's shot wasn't aimed at Ricardo's chest, but at something her trained eye had noticed beside him, a crate of kerosene lamps brought by the militia. The sound of shattering glass was followed by an eruption of flames. Fire, her former tormentor, became her weapon. A wall of black smoke and orange flame roared between the attackers, separating Ricardo from his men and plunging the clearing into panic and confusion. The militiamen, blinded by the smoke and frightened by the ferocity of a defense they hadn't expected, retreated in disarray. The distraction gave the camp's defenders, the women and elders, the chance they needed. Using knives, bows, and their cunning, they launched themselves at the disoriented men. Liana, reloading her rifle, didn't feel the heat of the flames on her face, only the icy strength of her determination. She had faced her greatest fear and transformed it into a shield for her people. The battle at the camp was short and brutal, and the chaos Liana created was the turning point. But true salvation came in the form of a war cry that echoed through the canyons. Gokliya and his warriors, victorious in their own ambush, stormed back. Seeing the camp under attack, their fury was unrelenting. They fell upon the remnants of the militia like avenging ghosts, ending the confrontation in moments. Amid the smoke and fallen bodies, Gokliya's eyes searched for a single person. He found her near the fire she had built, standing with her rifle still in her hands, her face smeared with soot that blended with her scars like war paint. He was wounded, a deep gash on his arm, but his gaze was one of pure admiration and wonder. Here was not the frail woman he had rescued in the desert, but one equal, a warrior who had saved them all. As the adrenaline of battle faded, pain and grief surfaced. The camp was a scene of destruction, but also of resilience. Amidst that scene, Liana did not rest. She became a center of calm and healing. Her first priority was Tazana, whom she treated with a blend of her own knowledge and the techniques she had learned from the elder, the two healers working in silent harmony. Then it was Gokliya's turn. As she cleaned and sutured the cut on her arm, the rest of the tribe watched in respectful silence. Kaito, whose face was streaked with soot and humility, brought her water without her asking. No one saw the Mexican or La Camada anymore. They saw one of their own, a woman whose wisdom had guided their strategy, whose courage had defended them in battle, and whose hands now healed their wounds. Later, as order began to be restored, Gokliya pulled her away from the stairs, into the stillness of the desert that was now his garden. "I saw you on the first day," he said, his voice low and filled with an emotion he rarely showed. "I didn't see a monster. I saw a fighter whom life tried to turn to ash, but who refused to fade." He lifted his hand, not to trace her scars, but to cup her face with infinite tenderness. They gave you a name of shame, he continued, looking into her eyes. But they were wrong. Slowly, he leaned in and kissed the deepest mark on her cheek, a kiss that was not of pity, but of adoration. He kissed her neck, her arm, every mark the fire had left. To me, he whispered against her skin, these are the marks of a queen. Time, like the river, smooths stones and creates new landscapes. Liana and Gokliya led their people, not with the authority of a king and queen in the European sense, but with the shared wisdom of two spirits who understood the value of survival. Liana never again wore a shawl to hide her face. Her scars, bathed in the desert sun, became a map of her journey, read with respect by the young men of the tribe she now taught. She fused her grandmother's curanderismo with Tazana's wisdom, becoming a healer whose reputation spread beyond the mountains. She moved through the camp with a quiet grace, her presence a source of strength and security. The woman who had run into the desert seeking death had instead found the most vibrant and full of lives, proving that home is not where you come from, but where you are truly seen. There was a day, many months later, when she found herself alone near a clear stream. Leaning to drink, she saw her own reflection. The image that stared back at her didn't make her flinch. For the first time, she didn't focus on the gnarled marks, the uneven skin. Instead, she saw the eyes, shining with knowledge and peace. She saw the line of her mouth, which now smiled more often than it cried. She saw the face of a beloved woman, a respected leader, a survivor who had transformed her wounds into bridges. The monster was gone. Forever. Not because the scars had faded, but because she finally understood what Gokliya and the Apaches had seen from the beginning. True beauty lies not in the absence of imperfections, but in the unshakable strength found in embracing them. Liana's journey teaches us a profound and universal truth about the nature of strength. We often believe our worth lies in our perfection, in hiding our wounds and presenting an intact facade to the world. But her story shows us otherwise. True resilience blossoms when we stop fighting our scars and begin to honor them as the teachers they are. They are proof that we were stronger than whatever tried to destroy us. The acceptance we seek from others only becomes possible when we first find it within ourselves, transforming the perception of our flaws into an inventory of our courage. The love she found was not a reward for healing, but the recognition that she was already whole, even in her broken pieces. Standing atop a cliff, the desert wind blowing through her hair, Liana watched the sunset beside Gokliya. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a comforting familiarity. She was no longer an outsider, and he was no longer her savior. They were two halves of the same force, leading a people who valued spirit over skin. The world was still a dangerous place, but she was no longer afraid, for she had found her true place, not on a piece of land, but in the acceptance of herself and in the hearts of her people. Liana's story teaches us that resilience isn't about not falling, but about the strength we find to rise. If this message touched your heart, subscribe and share this video so more stories of overcoming can reach those who need to hear them. Thanks for watching.